Hello, this is Sam Gerrans from samgerrans.com. Today is Friday, March the 24th, 2023, and today we're talking with Miri Finch. So, Miri, hello, thank you very much for joining me on this show. And
hello, Sam, thank you for having me on.
As a bit of background for people, full transparency, Miri and I are Facebook friends, or were Facebook friends in the good old days when I still used Facebook, and we found ourselves agreeing on an awful lot of things. And I just thought that I know Miri's work in some detail, and I just thought it would be interesting for people to get to know a little bit more about, you and your work. Tell me a bit about your background. I mean, for somebody who doesn't know Miri Finch from start, what do we need to know?
Okay, well, I think I first got involved in the very loosely defined truth movement about 10 years ago, and my kind of awakening moment is I was at university in the States, and the universities over there had quite stringent vaccine requirements, and they had asked for my childhood vaccine records before I went. But after I'd enrolled and I was taking classes, they actually threatened to kick me out and deport me from the country because they said I hadn't had enough measles vaccinations. So I was summoned to the medical centre and, given a real dressing down. And I said, but I've had a measles vaccination. I've never had measles, so perhaps it worked. But they were very firm, and it was only when I insisted on a blood test that I had to pay for myself that they agreed that I had antibodies, so I was supposedly immune, so they wouldn't kick me out. And that really catapulted me down the rabbit hole, because I was thinking if they would have such an extraordinary reaction to a relatively mild condition, kind of what's really going on here.
Can I just ask, how long ago was this? When did this happen?
This was 2013.
Okay. And that was your, as it were, epiphany, awakening moments. Okay.
Exactly.
So
yes.
What happened then?
So after I managed to persuade them not to expel and deport me, I started researching further the vaccine issue. And what I found, as I think for anyone who really starts digging deep on that issue, was very shocking. And I was particularly concerned about the amount of pressure they were putting on students, because I thought for a lot of them it's going to be their first time away from home, the first time they're making their own medical decisions, and a lot of people would have been bullied into that injection that they might not necessarily need or want. So my first real active inroads into the so-called truth movement were to make my own vaccine site, which was aimed particularly at students. So that's called Strive, and that's still up online. And it was this website which started to connect me to the wider movement. So through that, I started making connections and friends, and building up my network further. So by the time the quote-unquote pandemic hit in 2020, I was already what you would call, I guess, a fully fledged conspiracy theorist. So I thought from the start, this is a hoax, and this isn't real, and this is just being perpetrated for the purposes of social and political control. So then I've become a lot more active since then, and have now my own personal website, which is miriaf.co.uk, where I concentrate on kind of social commentary, particularly about government hoaxes, false flags, and more peripherally the vaccine issue as well.
Can I just ask you, how would you describe yourself politically before your awakening? What would you have described yourself as?
I was probably largely apolitical, but I would sometimes have arguments with most of my friends who were very liberal, as young people tend to be, and would err slightly towards more conservative positions on some issues. So I think in that sense it was easier for me to awaken, as it were, because I wasn't really deeply steeped in the liberal ideology.
Why do you think that was? Were there some sort of family background, or was this just something to do with you as an individual? Why do you think, because the whole of but the vast majority of certainly the kind of civilization or the culture that you get through media is all leftist. So were there any influences, family influences or other influences, that sort of drew you to a more critical view of the world?
Yeah, I think I did have a very liberal upbringing. So my father was a university lecturer, and my mother was very involved in a kind of Western interpretation of Buddhism. So these were both very liberal environments. And I think that gave me the ammunition to critique it a bit. So I was able to come out of the environments and think, well, these are certainly not perfect, and there are many things that we might criticise or might choose to do differently. So when I would talk to friends who'd had perhaps more quote unquote normal backgrounds, or leaning towards more traditional or more conservative backgrounds, I'd tell them about mine. They'd always say, "Oh wow, that's so cool." I wish my family was more like that. So I think it can be easier for us to critique what we had rather than what we didn't have.
I come from a similar background. I mean, not exactly the same, but certainly a liberal background. And personally, I just overdosed on it, and I could see that. Yeah. I saw the results. I mean, I don't know about you, but I mean, I'm quite a lot older than you. But having lived so long, the claims that liberalism was making in the 1970s and so on sounded great, but we've seen where it all goes, and so they're now no longer the new kid on the block, sort of the eternal group in opposition. They are now controlling all of the institutions, and so we've seen where all of that goes. Was there so this for you was the key event? You came up close and personal with the vaccine subject before it was a thing. Did you feel that it was an intrusion on your person? And what was it about this event that kind of needled you?
Well, for some reason, I don't really know what the reason is. I've always been very skeptical of pharmaceutical interventions since I was kind of in my middle teens. So I felt that if I was going to have a pharmaceutical intervention, there'd have to be a very good reason for it. And I thought that, measles isn't a very serious disease until pretty recently. Children just had it. And I thought, if I've also had a vaccine and haven't had measles, maybe it worked. But what I think was the really ominous part was just how draconian they were. And to try and coerce me into something that I'd said no to and given quite a good argument why I didn't want it, and they were so persistent. And I do remember actually asking them, because when I made my argument, look, I've had the vaccination, I haven't had the disease, maybe the vaccine worked, they wouldn't accept that. And I said, is the point that I'm immune to the disease or that I've had the vaccine? Because it seems to me it's the latter. So I realised that the rhetoric they presented me with was nothing to do with my health. It certainly wasn't anything to do with respecting my personal autonomy. So I thought there's obviously a lot more going on here.
Obviously, the people at the front end of all of this, they're just implementing something that they quite often don't really understand.
Yeah.
I don't mean to be putting words into your mouth, but was it the fact that did you feel that they just wanted your compliance, that was the number one thing with this, and that as long as you obeyed with whatever it is they're giving you, they would back off, but it was your lack of compliance that needled them?
Oh, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And this kind of went on because I did know a bit about how vaccines supposedly work, and that all they can do is provoke antibodies in the blood. So I said, can I have a blood test instead to see if I've already got the antibodies? And they said, you can, but you'll have to pay for it yourself and the vaccine will be free. I said, well, that's fine. I'll pay for it then. And they still weren't happy and actually said to me, it would be easier just to have the vaccine.
It would be easy just to bend over and do precisely what we say. Again, I don't mean to be putting words into your mouth, but this was in America, supposedly, the land of the free, the home of the brave, etc. What university were you at there?
It was a branch of the State University of New York, in Potsdam, which is a little village just below the Canadian border.
Okay. So they did you get into a point of reminding them about the Constitution, or did you not take it that far?
No, I didn't take it that far. I hadn't done the politics module yet. But I think the only reason that they eventually accepted my position was that I did know enough to ask for the blood test. But I think the majority of people are not aware that you can have a blood test to show if you've already got those antibodies, and therefore the vaccine would be useless.
Now, after this, my view is that people have a sort of, as it were, an awakening. There's a thing that needles them. I think for some people it was 9/11, for some people it was 7/7, for other people it was the bombing of Iraq or whatever it is. And then after that, you sort of go through a period of readjustment to the new reality that you're in. Was your period of readjustment attended by, stresses with family and friends and so on?
I think what I learned quite quickly was to keep my opinions to myself.
Well, so I have to say, sorry, Mia, I don't mean to jump in here, but you haven't been doing a very good job because...
not lately. No, not recently. But in that initial period, I kind of led a bit of a double life where I go onto internet forums and speak to strangers about what I was finding out. But in my day-to-day life, and family and friends and people at the university and so on, I just didn't speak to them about it because I realised instinctively I think this is not gonna go down well. Obviously things have changed since, but yes, at the beginning there was a lot of wariness. So I think that's why there was a significant gap between this initial awakening and me finally going public with something, which probably didn't happen for about 2 or 3 years later.
Okay, now when you went public, what form did that take?
So initially it was just some kind of cautious posts on Facebook trying to scout out if anybody on my existing friends list agreed with me, and one or two people did. But then I started, going into so-called anti-vax groups and just adding a lot of people, which is, I imagine, how we connected. I just kind of went and added to hugely increase my friend count, and then I started to connect with more like-minded people. But the real thing that helped connect me was producing my own vaccine site, an idea which was actually suggested to me by the scientist Chris Exley. So he has been very persecuted for doing research into vaccine dangers, and actually this ultimately terminated his career quite prematurely. And he did suggest that a way that I could become more active in this field was to do my own site specifically targeted at students, because nothing really like that existed. So when that resource came on the scene, that really did help put me in touch with a lot of like-minded people, and then things kind of escalated from there.
Well, after the video, when we finished, I'll put links to your sites in the description down below so people can go and see those. When you'd gone through this sort of reveal, as it were, of your going from, as it were, sort of the dark web of your conspiracy to coming out, putting your name to it and all the rest of it, were there repercussions? I mean, the reason why I ask this, I think that everybody who isn't really drinking the government Kool-Aid, and I mean, who can still be drinking this nonsense at this stage? Maybe 20 years ago, you could kind of justify it if you really wanted to, but now it's so ridiculous. I mean, we're living in a freak show. We're living in a clown world. So I think people either decide to bury their heads even further in the sand, which just gets hotter and hotter and hotter because the sand's getting hotter and hotter and hotter, or they kind of shadow wake up, or they actually come out, as it were, full-fledged waking up. It's a bit like, I was just thinking, it's the society would be quite kind of fine if you'd been a closet homosexual and then became a sort of open homosexual. It would back you up on that. But if you actually want to use your brain and start asking actual questions, they do shout you down and call you names. That's kind of all they've got. So my question is, when you came out, as it were, loud and proud, were there some repercussions for you in your personal life?
Oh, huge, yes. And I think I probably lost about 95% of my friends who just thought I'd gone completely insane. So I really thank God for the internet, because it's kind of put me in touch with almost everyone who's in my life now. So there were one or two people who did message me privately and say, I agree with you on the vaccine issue. But there was very little public support in my existing social circle at that time. I've been... I think luckier than some with my family, who have generally been quite supportive, and the ones who aren't supportive just kind of keep a distance from me rather than outright condemning me. So I think that I know a lot of people have had it much, much worse. So in answer to your question, yes, so there were huge repercussions, but thankfully, because of the power of the internet, I was able to re-people my life relatively quickly after losing everyone who'd been in it beforehand.
It's interesting how quickly they kind of peel away, isn't it? People that you previously thought you'd be friends with for life, and then you realised that if they're going to just, I mean, especially like we both come from liberal backgrounds, and that the liberals all speak this language of openness and inclusion and considering other people's points of view. But the second that you challenge them with something which doesn't fit into their box, they turn into these, well, in my experience, they turn quite often into these really rabid, I don't like to use the word Nazis because it's an incorrect use of the word, but like a parody, like a cartoon of what we think of as being, sort of German Third Reich. And and interestingly, they if you point it out to them, they can't see it. And in my experience, the way they justify it to themselves is, you're such a despicable person for having a view which doesn't fit into their little box. They are not only justified in treating you as some sort of leper, they're actually more righteous because they're even deigning to talk to you at all. I mean, I think we've all had this. The reason why I wanted to hit this point is because a lot of people on my channel, for various reasons, have had a waking up experience and had problems on a range of subjects with families. The quote that I really like, and which says it all to me, is they tell you to think for yourself, they just don't like it when you do. And that really sort of did it for me. Well, I'm okay. So between 2013 and today, obviously you had your what in sort of cinema terms is called the initiating incident, the thing that kind of woke you up, the call to the hero's call to action, as it were. And then after that, you have to fight through your sort of existing network and sort of you get tested whether you really believe this thing or not. Have there been other subjects once you became open to this subject? Were there other subjects that then you began to revisit or question that are generally accepted, or at least understood to be accepted across the broader society?
Well, yeah, and I think probably all of them. I kind of came to the conclusion that if the mainstream promotes it, then it's not true, or it's not wholly true. So for some of the examples you mentioned, like 9/11, it seems incredible to me that there are still people who sincerely and passionately believe that wasn't an inside job, that happened just as the mainstream media said it did. But there are these people, and I've had arguments with them quite recently. I think I started to question more and more, and the overarching conclusion that I've drawn is that, in a way, we live in a simulation. Like the reality that is presented to us by the mainstream media and by a lot of our dominant institutions really isn't real, and that turns a lot of your paradigms and your understanding of reality on its head. So I think it's really good advice to question everything, and not to say that every single thing the mainstream media ever prints is a lie, but to start from that standpoint, it could be a lie, and we have to look a bit deeper to find, well, quite a lot deeper to find out what the truth is.
I agree with that. I mean, once you start unpicking this, you realize that pretty much you're living in a designed matrix of opinions that a good way, what I do quite often is just step back 100 years and just think, what would I have thought of this 100 years ago if somebody presented it to me? And you just think this is ridiculous. And going to 9/11, for example, I mean, the very simple thing is Building 7. No plane hit Building 7. Nobody claims that any plane hit Building 7, and yet it came down. What I noticed myself, even among the commentariat, as they're called today, even thinking more conservative people in that realm, they now have dropped 9/11. They won't really talk about it, and you're just supposed to just pretend it didn't happen, but it did happen. And it's really, that was the key moment, I think, when these powers or organizations decided, right, we're going to move to the next phase. This was their big day. 9/11 was their big day, and everything that happened before that was in one phase, and everything that's happened after that is in another phase. So we still have laws in the books which are predicated on the illusion of 9/11. And if 9/11 was not 19 hours with box cutters who couldn't fly a Cessna plane, then who was it? We still have this gaping hole in everything. Anyway, I'm sure we could talk about that, to the cows come home. But what were the other subjects? I mean, 9/11, were there other subjects that sort of you suddenly realised, oh my goodness, this isn't true, then this isn't true, then this isn't true?
Well, I think for a long time, my focus was primarily on vaccines. And it probably wasn't until 2020 that I really started to look more widely at all the other things. And so at that point, my focus became, I think, primarily on COVID. But this kind of underscored the idea that every major event is to a greater or lesser extent a hoax. Not to say that people don't really get hurt and killed, they certainly do, but that that they're orchestrated. And I think we could say that about the conflicts in Iraq and Syria, about the world wars, that we have these puppet masters basically scripting and stage managing events and trying to persuade us that they're spontaneous and organic. When nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, I guess there are loads of examples. The moon landings, I know it's a contentious one, but to me seems quite obviously fabricated.
I agree with you entirely. I mean, the best description of the moon landings I ever saw was she said to me, it just looks like an art project. I mean, really telling me that this is real. I couldn't agree with you more. And it's all lies. So let me just ask you, before we get into some of your sort of specialist subjects, why do you think they're doing this, and what do you think they want?
I think a major thing, which they're not even don't try to hide at all, is mass depopulation. They think there's far too many of us, so they're trying to cull the herd, a big one. And the other thing they want is control. For no other reason. I think they are intergenerational psychopaths. They do know how to induce that in the next generation, and they're control freaks, and they just want as much control over us as they can have, because they enjoy that. And I think to non-psychopathic people, that's very difficult to understand. Why do you want control over people just for the sake of it? But that is what psychopaths want. That's
true, and you're right, because we wouldn't personally do that. We find it very hard to understand that other people would do it. I hear the same arguments trotted out, and it rather irritates me. Two of them. One is that it's about money, just follow the money. And then I say, well, they print money. They can make as much money as they want. They don't care about money. Or the other supposed explanation for everything is ineptitude. They're incompetent. And I don't buy into that either, because I see the same agenda being rolled out year after year after year. Now, you can't put this... They're very lucky to be that inept so consistently. So, I mean, what are your feelings on that? Do you think we're following a business plan, or do you think that they are simply greedy and or inept?
No, I couldn't agree with you more, and I've actually addressed this on my site quite recently. I said we've got to stop going down this, inept, bumbling politicians ruse. There's a lot of pejorative words we could describe for high-profile politicians, but inept and incompetent are just not words we should use at all. They're incredibly competent. They know exactly what they're doing. And this ineptitude thing is a kind of a way of neutralising themselves to us. So Boris Johnson has now gone to the newspapers and declared that he's not a liar, he's just a moron. So his defence for how he handled the COVID pantomime and why he broke all the rules. Not that he was lying to anyone, not that he didn't follow his own rules. It's just that he's too stupid and he didn't understand the rules. That's what he said.
That's his defence, is it?
Yes.
I'm just too dumb, Your Honour. I couldn't understand the paperwork. I don't live in the UK, so how's the British public swallowing this one?
Well, I think they are swallowing it because that's been his image. That he has that ridiculous hair and he's bumbling and he says stupid things, and this and he's even admitted this himself to a certain degree is a persona. It's an act. So Boris isn't his actual name. So his name that his family and friends use is Alexander. Boris is one of his middle names, and he adopted it at university as part of a persona he was developing to then play on the world stage. So it's this bumbling, harmless, lovable Boris who just doesn't know what he's doing. And I think the reality couldn't be any further from the truth. I think people who do know him well would confirm he's very, very sharp. He's very bright. He's ruthlessly competent, and he knows exactly what he's doing. And I think that goes for all high-level political actors and members of the ruling classes. I mean, it's a very clever act to get the public to believe that they're incompetent. And I totally agree with you about money as well. Absolutely. I think that they like relieving us of money because that takes away our power. But I don't think they particularly want any more for themselves just for the sake of it. No.
Do you think? I mean, if you look at the sort of music culture going back, especially from the Beatles and then moving forward, it seemed to me that with the sort of democratization of everything, what does well is what plays to the largest number of people. So if you look at the Beatles, for example, they were working class lads. Now most people are working class, or at least they can relate to that. And so it gave people a sense of, well, they're like me, I could be a Beatle, as it were. Do you think there's any truth in the idea that the reason why they project this stupidity, incompetence, even corruption, if you like, upon themselves, and I'm not saying they're not corrupt in some really, really fundamental way, but we've agreed they don't need the money. Is it because they think that we're stupid and incompetent and corrupt, and it makes them easier for us to relate to?
That's a very good point. I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but I think I would say, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that worked well with the rehabilitation of Matt Hancock. I don't know if this it's got to in Russia, but after his stint as a politician, he then became a reality TV star on a terrible program called I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, where celebrities go and survive in the jungle for 3 weeks and it's filmed. He went on that, and the public response to him was excellent because, again, he played the dumb card like Boris Johnson did, and said, I was under a lot of pressure, I made mistakes. And the public response to him was incredible. They said, he comes across like a really nice guy. We'd all make mistakes in that situation. Everyone deserves a second chance. So, yeah, I think you're right. That is what they're trying to do.
So the way they get out is by making like they're as dumb as they think everybody watching them is, and then they get a pass.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Do you think that they all do this, or do you think there are just sort of certain placeholders? Because I would have said somebody like Liz Truss is objectively stupid. But I agree with you about Boris Johnson. Absolutely, the guy's as sharp as a razor blade. He's got a stunning education. He knows Greek. He knows Greek philosophy. He went to some very, very good schools. And I don't know how hard he studied, but he doesn't strike me like a stupid person. He never has. But would you agree there are some genuine morons amongst them as well?
Yes, absolutely, and I think that makes sense, doesn't it? Because it gives them more of a valid cover if they're people. Yeah, people who are actually stupid, but the ones who aren't can kind of camouflage themselves more easily.
Because, I mean, if I look at somebody like, for example, Kamala Harris, I just thought that she was out of her depth completely in the job that she does. But apparently she's a lawyer, and I saw her online being a lawyer, and she was equally inept in that as well. So what I think we've got is a sort of a kind of a visible elite, and I'm sure we would agree that there is an actual elite above the people who we vote for. So there are some genuine thick people in there who are just midwit obedient, but you've got these very, very bright people who understand the plan in there as well. So what about Rishi Sunak? What's your view of him?
Well, he's very interesting, actually, and I did a whole article on him shortly after he was non-democratically installed in Downing Street, and he seems to be an intelligence asset because there's a common flag with these people is that their backstories don't stack up. They say they went to this school and this university, and then their classmates don't remember them. So Rishi Sunak alleges that he did an MBA, I think it was at Stanford, and none of his professors have any recollection of him. So what I found from looking into this is a common cover for people who are doing intelligence training. They'll kind of be given an official backstory that they're at this university, and they will have a place there and all the rest of it, but they won't be going to classes, that they'll be off being trained for their future role. So I think that he's some kind of intelligence asset who's doing work for the deep state, and that's why it's been installed in Downing Street.
Okay, so I mean, I got that same sort of feeling about Obama, and this isn't party politics for me. He just looked to me like a bit of a non-entity who'd had quite a lot of NLP training and various other things that he could manipulate the crowd. And you can tell if somebody actually understands what they're talking about or not. And he seemed to me not really to understand what he was doing at all, but to be doing it very sort of confidently, as it were. So who do you have a view on who's behind this?
I think it's the same people who've been behind world events for hundreds and hundreds of years. We're getting towards a kind of end game for them, which the conditions have had to be right for them to achieve. First of all, they needed the technological advances that they didn't have 300 years ago that they have got now. And in particular, they needed AI advances because they've had to grudgingly tolerate the presence of many humans on the earth for a long time because they needed the human labour. And now that AI is advancing so rapidly and can do so much that humans used to rely on humans for, that I think that's why they're instituting the mass depopulation agenda. And I think there's a lot of evidence that there's certain family names involved, and you'll find the same names again and again if you go back throughout history. And they believe that they're kind of gods on earth and that the world belongs to them. We're just tenants and we're being evicted. Yep,
I agree with you. It seemed to me my take on the whole COVID thing was that what they were really doing was, if you were stupid enough to take this, then you were really opting out of the gene pool. And if you look at all the jobs that don't require any kind of intelligence and brains, well, they can all be done now by machines and AI. The only jobs that really AI and machines can't do are jobs that require genuine reasoning skills. So it seemed to me like it was a bit of a vote. Do you want to go through into the next century? Well, then you need to be able to think well enough to see that this isn't a good thing to do. Whereas because if all you need is obedience and mechanical requirement, or the mechanical emotional need to comply with authority, well, robots can do all of that. Computers can do all of that. We don't need people. What we need are people who can actually think strategically and critically. And those people are not going to take this vaccine. They're just not going to do it. And they're going to take a bit of heat for it. What was it like for you during the COVID rollout? Because it seemed to me, just briefly, it seemed to me that that whole period was just a beta test. I don't believe that that's the actual thing. I think this was really about training the police, training the medical staff to obey. It was and weeding out any possible difficult people, because they would clearly be vocal quite quickly. A lot of GPs left, a lot of police left. Basically, they could weed out all of the good people. Firstly, do you agree that this COVID was a beta test? And secondly, what was it like for you personally, knowing what you know, living through this in the UK?
Yeah, I think you're right, because in reality, it wasn't that bad. I mean, obviously it was for people in certain professions, like if you were being forced out of your job because if you're in care and you wouldn't get the vaccine. But otherwise, life did more or less continue pretty normally. I mean, some venues were shut for a while, but this wasn't kind of like troops on the street. Your life is in imminent danger. And once people found ways to work around the lockdown restrictions, which those of us who opposed them quite quickly did, I personally didn't find it that bad. There were a few clashes about, people barking at me to wear a mask and so on and so forth. But no, it was quite endurable. And like I said, I know for some people in some circumstances it was much worse. But me personally, I didn't find it too terrible. But I think you're right that this is training us, because I think that it's quite well known they've got a 10-year plan, which started in 2020. So we're really only just about a third of a way through it. I think that they're going to come back now with things which are much worse and much more draconian and much more difficult to get out of. So I don't know if you've heard about this emergency alert system in the UK that they've just introduced.
No, I haven't heard about it.
Okay, so on the 23rd of April, the government is going to send out a test emergency alert to every mobile phone in the country, and you can't switch it off. It's going to go off like a loud siren on your phone. And until you acknowledge it, all the functionality on your phone will be frozen. So they're they're forcing you to interact with this. So I think this is a kind of this on its own is a taste for saying, if you don't comply, we'll freeze you out of your life, because so many people are obviously reliant on their phones for work, for family, and they're saying you won't be able to use it unless you do what we say. But also everyone's now asking, well, why do we need an emergency alert system? We've never needed one before. So I think that they're building up to something quite significant that they intend to impose a lot more stringently than the COVID thing. And, there's speculation on what it might be. Is it going to be some sort of war with Russia? Is it going to be the much fated alien invasion? But I think it's clear that something's coming, and that, yes, COVID was a mass behavioural psychology experiment. They've seen that they can make people comply to really ridiculous things quite easily by frightening them. So I think they're laying off a bit now, and then they're going to come back harder next time.
I agree. And I was just thinking, as you were saying about mobile phones, that was another thing they had to get in place before they could really roll out their larger tyranny. They needed 5G, they needed ubiquitous internet, and they needed to basically make it so that you can't have a life unless you have this phone. And people are terrified of losing it. I mean, understandably, if you've got all your bank details, all of your contacts, all of your messages and everything on there. So this is how they're going to flick the switch. They're just going to, they can turn you on and off, turn your life on or off. And so, I mean, it's reminiscent of Revelation, isn't it? The mark of the beast, and not being able to buy or sell unless you have the number or the mark or the number of his name or whatever it is. In your day-to-day life, do you find now, 10 years on from your experience in America, that more people are open to this kind of conversation? Is there a sort of is there a widening of the gap between those who are quote unquote woken up and those who are still quote unquote asleep? How is it in your experience?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think that COVID was so ridiculous that unless you're completely unreachable, and I think probably about 20% of people are, then then you've got the kind of 20% extreme conspiracy theorists. At the other hand, you've got the 60% in the middle who are asking questions, thinking, "What is going on?" And yeah, I think that there is much more open-mindedness now, and much more receptivity to these kind of conversations. And I think people in highly public-facing roles, especially, have really realised what complete nonsense COVID was, and so you can really have quite good conversations with them. I had a lot of good conversations with taxi drivers, people who work in hospitality, people who work in supermarkets. They'd say, I never questioned anything before. My life was just going to work, watching TV, whatever. But after this, I started thinking, what is going on? Because we obviously weren't told the truth about COVID. So, what else aren't we being told the truth about? The
professions that you just mentioned are generally working class professions. My experience is that working class people often, not always, I mean, this isn't a hard and fast rule, but are generally far more switched on when it comes to these sorts of things and able to reason for themselves. The hardest people to reach are the supposed intellectuals, and especially the upper middle classes, that I think we both come from. It's almost impossible, because these people who read the Guardian or the Telegraph or whatever it is that I mean, I don't live in the UK anymore, so I'm asking, is that your experience too? How do people in the in the nice cars who live in Hampstead and so on, are they open to a conversation, or are they just hoping that it's all going to go away?
No, you're absolutely right. This has been a massive class divide on this, and there was a saying that lockdown was middle class people locking themselves away in their homes and working class people bringing them things. So I think that's absolutely right. Obviously, there's always been a class divide in Britain, but this has just made it into a huge chasm, and even I'd say there's a regional divide. So I live in Yorkshire, which is the north of England, and there's much more open-mindedness to these kind of conversations here than London and further south. So yeah, I think this is really a class issue, an education issue, an affluence issue, and I believe what's very interesting about the COVID vaccine is that up until the COVID vaccine, the demographics for vaccine refusal were very clear. That the more educated, the more affluent you were, the more likely you were to refuse vaccines. And the most vaccine hesitant parents are those with PhDs in hard sciences. And that's been the rule up until COVID, at which point the trend reversed. And in COVID, the affluent communities, especially the white affluent communities, are much, much more likely to take it. And it is the working class communities and it is the less affluent who have been more sceptical. So that's an interesting turnaround. And yeah, I think ultimately the middle classes could afford to entertain the delusions of COVID and lockdown. The working classes simply couldn't, so they were more incentivized to see through it.
So rather than it being a kind of an innate intellectual curiosity, it was more that they just actually needed to work, and they couldn't just work from home because an Uber taxi is going to actually have to move somewhere in the real world. Do you think that was the reason, that it was driven by economic requirements?
Yeah, I think that was a huge part of it, absolutely. And also the fact that many working class people have jobs that you can't do from home meant they weren't able to ratify the illusion by playing their part in the same way the middle classes were. So the middle classes could stay at home, they could be furloughed, they could work from home, and that makes it all seem more real to them, and they can tell themselves, well, if I stepped foot outside, I'd instantly die. But the working classes were forced to go to work, so even if they were concerned at first, it would very quickly become apparent to them, well, nothing's happening to me, nothing's happening to my friends, nothing's happening to my colleagues. So I think that dose of reality quickly kicked in.
So it forced them outside, and they realised people aren't dropping dead in the streets, and I went to work yesterday, I'm going to go try again tomorrow. That's absolutely fascinating. Is there something about, do you think, white middle class people that makes them more susceptible to this nonsense about virtue signalling? That they're easier to program. If you tell them that something's virtuous, they just have to do it. Do you see? Is there any truth in that, do you think?
Absolutely, I think that's completely true. But I don't understand why it is. I've thought about it a lot, and non-white liberals are not as bad as this. What is it about the combination of being white, being middle class, and being liberal that creates what you're describing? And I'm not quite sure what it is.
Well, I have. I think it's a leftover from the Protestant religions. I mean, in England, of course, we've got the Anglican Church, which is kind of a hybrid of Protestant and Catholic. But I think in the Protestant religion, there's the Protestant work ethic, the need to prove oneself through actions, and I think that the majority of these, I suppose they'd be called Karens today, out there getting very, very emotional about various subjects. They would have been church-going women 150 years ago who would have what they are is very compliant, and they were very compliant in that system, and they've just become very compliant in this system. But I think they need to over-express it. So what they tend to do is to work out which way the wind's blowing, and then they gush along in the same direction, and they think that this allows them to express some sort of individuality or, as it were, hyper religiosity. Whereas I don't think people from the working classes or people from perhaps other ethnic backgrounds have that same need, because life is tough as it is. We don't need to overstate it. I could be wrong, but that's the way I've understood it.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. Yeah, absolutely. And I have thought, if we have a cultural catapult, which I think is quite likely, and go to the other social extreme of extreme conservatism, I think we'd actually find that these people would be equally compliant to that. I don't think that they would be revolutionaries and fighting for a return to liberalism.
No, I absolutely agree with you. And I've noticed that these sort of NPCs, non-player characters, as it were, it doesn't matter what society you put them in. They are compliant and obedient and expressive of the dominant ideology, no matter what it is. And so if they'd grown up in Ayatollah Khomeini's Iran, they would be dyed-in-the-wool kind of Shias. If they grew up under Mao Zedong, they would be, sort of ardent communists. Now what they are is, what's interesting, a writer that I talk about quite a lot on my channel, Jacques Ellul, he talks about this to some extent, and other writers, also Ted Kaczynski talks about this. This idea is that these people, they like to think of themselves as somehow radical and different, but they're actually not. What they actually are what they are is uber obedient, and that's how they achieve, I suppose, the highest level of on Maslow's pyramid of needs, of recognition, of feeling that they're doing something worthy, is by being more strident and more obedient than you are, and then turning around and blaming everyone else for not being as strident and obedient as they are. That's how they make themselves feel valuable, I guess.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that's perfectly encapsulated. Yeah.
I'd like to move on now to some of your other interests. Now, you've taken an interest in Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate is a chap who I suppose has been somewhat vilified in the Western media. I have to say I've seen all of 4 minutes of Andrew Tate sort of strutting up and down. He's from where I'm standing, he seems to be a kind of a cartoon archetype of an alpha male, but it isn't really alpha male, because if you're actually alpha, you're centered in yourself, and you don't. I mean, there are people like this, but I don't think you'd feel as much need to kind of scream and shout about yourself as Andrew Tate obviously does. But you've done the research on him, so I'm just going to let you take the floor. What's your view on Andrew Tate and what his role is in all of this?
Okay, so I think Andrew Tate's very interesting, and I think he, like many on the world stage, we've discussed, e.g. Boris Johnson and so on, I think he's an actor and he's playing a part. I think he's a very good actor. He's very persuasive, but he is an actor, and I don't believe what he's promoting is authentic. And I have looked into him quite a bit, and it appears that his father was a CIA asset. And what one often finds is that people who become very prominent on the world stage and become change agents for the culture very often have parents in high-ranking military intelligence backgrounds. I don't know if you've ever heard of David McGowan.
No, I haven't.
Well, he's a fantastic researcher who has really brought this to light in a series of books that he did, showing that people who kind of come out of nowhere and have huge impacts on the culture, like, for instance, Jim Morrison of The Doors, they very often have these military intelligence parents. And effectively, what popular culture is at those very high levels is military-grade mind control, and these people often use their children for that, put their children forward to various intensive training programs when they're growing up, and then launch them on the world stage as change agents. So I think that's what's going on with Andrew Tate. And I do think that in the UK, we've gone to such insane, extreme, degenerate levels of liberalism. There's nowhere the cultural pendulum can go now except back the other way. I think we are going to come in for a very significant social cultural revolution, and I think Andrew Tate is tasked with bringing that to the young. So Andrew Tate is exceptionally famous amongst young people, especially boys and young men aged about 14 to 24. And he's so famous that every school teacher knows his name because the students talk about him so much. And I've talked to some boys in this age group, and they say he is more famous than famous. It's not like a David Beckham level of fame. He's more famous than any sports star, than any pop star. He's like a god in these circles. And I think if people aren't in touch with teenage boys, they're not quite aware of how much impact this guy has, and that hasn't waned since his arrest, which I think was staged. So what I think he is kind of a Pied Piper tasked with in inducting the youth into the next stage of the social revolution. And now, of course, I think any reasonable person agrees that we've had far too much liberalism, and we do need to go back the other way. But I think, as they always do, the ruling classes are going to harness these natural desires and twist them to their own ends. So what I actually think Andrew Tate is tasked with doing, this may sound like a bit of a leap, but I will qualify it. I think he's tasked with ultimately trying to destroy Islam in the same way that the ruling classes have done to Christianity, because Andrew Tate has allegedly had an epiphany and a conversion. He now describes himself as a fundamentalist Muslim, but he believes that normal Muslims aren't real Muslims, and that the only real Muslims are ISIS. So that is his stated position.
Can I just ask, do you have any idea on what level of study this erudite Mr. Tate has spent studying the Quran and the religion of Islam, or did this opinion just sort of jump out fully formed?
I think, we'd go with the latter. It seems to be a huge surprise to everyone, because a lot of his fans don't actually know that he's a fundamentalist Muslim. And when this is pointed out to them, they're like, oh, really? This must be new. So I think this is kind of, yes, this has come out of nowhere. And I think the biggest obstacle that the ruling classes currently have to their desired future of a one world government and kind of no borders, no countries, no religions, as laid out in John Lennon's Imagine, is Islam. I think that's the biggest obstacle they've got, and that they want to try and attack it and weaken it like they've done to Christianity, and I think they're going to use Andrew Tate to do that.
That's very interesting. I would have said that Andrew Tate is not alone. They seem to have quite a lot of other people doing this, but Andrew Tate is able to reach down into a generation of boys that are screaming out for an alpha male to follow because they've been surrounded by women at home, because a lot of houses don't have a father in the house, and then they go to school where they're surrounded by women telling them what to do, and then comparing them with girls who are often able to sit there for much longer times and just comply, whereas boys, they want to go out, they want to do things. So you think that he's really aimed at that demographic, and that the idea is to, they've imported, it wasn't exactly Islam, but they've imported a lot of people from formerly or currently Islamic countries into the West. Do you think that somebody like this Andrew Tate, is going to be someone who can touch the Islamic youth, or is it for non-Islamic youth? I'm talking about Islamic culturally here.
I couldn't honestly say that I've got a good enough sense of who's listening to him to say. I suspect that he's mainly targeted at the secular youth who haven't got that sense of identity, whose ancestral Christian heritage is withered away, because they've got that big vacuum there. So I think that he's there to fill that. And
where do you think he's going to take this? Because he strikes me as a cartoon character, and I understand that if you want to be big on social media and everything, you kind of have to be larger than life. I suppose Donald Trump, he's understood that you have to make the big statement. Everything has to be huge and the biggest and the best, because everyone's competing for attention. But even so, in the 6 minutes I've spent listening to him, he just seemed to be a braggart, basically. Shouting about it almost like that kind of horrible rap, but without music. I'm the biggest, I'm the best, I'm the greatest, the things that Muhammad Ali did so well. He just seems to do very, very badly. What do you think it is he's going to do to whatever we mean by Islam? What do you think the plan is there?
I think that he wants to misrepresent it in the same way that ISIS do. So I think we presumably would agree that ISIS are a kind of CIA Mossad creation. Yes. Yeah. So I think that this is Andrew Tate is going to be used to demonize Islam in the same way The Handmaid's Tale was used to demonize Christianity. So, to misinterpret totally what the doctrine says, take it to huge extremes, and so the reaction from the people is to then reject it. So I think that's where he's taking it. Because like you said, he's a cartoon character. He's too exaggerated. He's too over the top. He's not giving a nuanced argument, and we can see why that appeals to certain people. But we also have to say, well, what's his end game here? And how does someone become more famous than famous, which is quoting some teenage boys that I've talked to, not without full establishment backing, of course.
And also, for him is he white? He looks sort of white to me.
I think he's half and half.
Okay, but he's certainly not a full-on black man or an Arab or something like this. It's interesting that he's got media cover when it comes to dealing with Islam. I know something about this. You have to pick your battles and pick them quite wisely. And for a long time, the Islamic immigrants into the West were verboten. You couldn't, they were beyond you couldn't touch them. You couldn't criticize them. That seems to have changed. I'm interested in why are they not attacking him? Because there are lots of opinions about what Islam is and isn't, and a lot of those, there are a lot of very well organized, sort of people in the West who claim to speak for Islam. Is he not getting attacked by mullahs and so on? Honestly,
I'm not entirely sure. I haven't seen a lot of evidence of that, but I do know what happens in the so-called conspiracy theory community. When someone says, reflects some of our views, we're so grateful to them for doing that we're kind of prepared to push other stuff about them under the carpet. and I've seen this happen several times, that people who might have some very, very questionable and shady beliefs on other things, if they, for instance, come out and say the COVID vaccine's bad, there's such relief from the community that someone is calling that out, that you'll get behind them and just try and kind of ignore the rest of what they're saying. So although I don't know for sure, it could be that certain members of the Islamic community are so pleased that he's representing Islam on the world stage, and he does quote the Quran a lot on his Twitter. And when they take pictures of him going to court, he carries the Quran with him. So he is raising the profile of Islam in that way.
I see. So that you basically have to take the whole package, and they give you the honey, but there's the poison pill inside. Is he currently in prison? Is that where he is now?
Yeah, so he's on a hold with his brother while the Romanian authorities, which is where he currently lives, claim to be looking to gather evidence on him. They haven't found any yet. They've had him on this hold since late December. So you'd think if there was this evidence by late March, they'd have found it. So I think the whole thing is staged. There was a similar time a very obviously staged faked arrest of Greta Thunberg, which was kind of revealed as faked. And I think they've just done the same to Andrew Tate, and he actually himself has said this on his Twitter account, which remarkably he has access to from jail, that going to jail when you're innocent is part of the hero's journey. This is what he said, and this is what I said from the beginning. This is about building his martyr status. He tweets a lot about how terrible jail is and how it's making him stronger as a person. And this is going to see his star kind of rise to meteoric fame and a kind of mythical status when he's finally, vindicated, which I'm sure he will be.
Well, if you take someone like Joseph Campbell, the hero with 1,000 faces, it's almost required. One of the stages in the hero's journey is to be put in prison. There's a lot of precedents for that. I mean, Hitler was in prison, of course. You've got Nelson Mandela was in prison. Here in Russia, Khodorkovsky, they put him in prison for a while because my view was that they wanted him to be the next president, and so they stuck him in prison for a while. So he's got his prison cred, like he suffered for the truth, and now he can be trusted to lead the masses, into the future, like a Pied Piper sort of character. Well, let's. At least he's going to have a lot of time to read the Quran, so perhaps he'll actually be able to learn a little bit about it. I'm going to move on now to your own political activism, and I know that you're connected with a group called Freedom Alliance. Could you tell us a bit about that and what it means to you?
Yeah, so up until 2020, I think a lot of people in the conspiracy theory community, was completely disillusioned with politics. Never even voted, certainly never been politically active beyond that. But when the whole COVID situation started, I was kind of the opinion that, there's no one big thing we can do to address this. There's just lots of little spanners we can throw in the works. So I did all the stuff of going to protests and signing petitions and all the rest of it. But some local friends of mine decided they wanted to start a political party. And I thought, well, I don't think this is, the answer, but this is another form of activism that we can get involved in. So they started Freedom Alliance in 2020. And it did grow very quickly. So Freedom Alliance, as the name suggests, was sort of non-partisan. It was supposed to appeal to people from the left, from the right, moderates, but people who were pro-freedom from state tyranny, who were against the COVID measures, against the mandates, mask mandates, vaccine mandates, and just wanted some political representation because, all the existing parties went completely lockstep. There was no meaningful opposition. The only opposition was that Boris Johnson's government wasn't authoritarian enough and should be more authoritarian. There was nobody really saying this is all nonsense and should be scrapped. So Freedom Alliance stood a lot of candidates at primarily local council elections, but they did stand some by-elections too, and stood, I think, over 150 candidates in the council elections in May 2021. And I got involved in this, and I've stood in 2 council elections, which has been a very eye-opening process, and made me realise that they, the shadowy they, the establishment, really do not want ordinary people involved in politics at that level. They're quite happy for you to go into the ballot box and put your X in the thing. But when you start to get kind of behind the scenes involved, they're very, very hostile to you. So one very illustrative event all the votes are counted in a central location and you can attend it. And we did attend it. And all the other representatives were there, the Labour guy, the Conservative guy, the local MP. And they all knew who we were because we'd all got press coverage and all this bit. But they'll hobnob with each other, but they completely blanked us. So they give us, the odd hostile look, but they will not engage with you. The contempt kind of oozes off them. Meanwhile, they're very, very supportive of the Monster Raving Loonies. So when the Monster Raving Loonies vote count is read out, all the other legacy parties give them a big cheer. So I think what this revealed is they're very in favour of the Monster Raving Loonies because they kind of represent the idea that if you don't vote for a big party, Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem, Green, then you're a loony. And that's it. Those are your options. So they actually support them because they give credence to the main parties. But real opposition, they hate. And I thought, if they're so hostile to us, there must be some meaningful purpose in continuing with this. So Freedom Alliance has had some internal issues, as political parties often do. And a lot of the key personnel have now moved on to another project, which is called the Vote Freedom Project. And this, instead of being a political party, is a network to support people to stand as independents. Because what we learned from the political process is that people who are disillusioned with political parties are disillusioned with all political parties, even ones with a pro-freedom bent, but they're much more likely to trust a genuinely independent candidate. So this project is now supporting people to stand as independents at the upcoming council elections in May. And it seems that it might be particularly important to do that now because I think that democracy, as we know, which obviously is very corrupt and no kind of magical salve, but I think it is on its last legs and is likely to give way to something worse. So voter turnout has been going down and down year on year. And then this year, for the first time, the UK has introduced voter ID. So obviously that's another obstacle and will bring voter turnout down yet further. So I think they are trying to scrap this system, and that while we've still got it, we might as well try and use it. So I'm going to now stand for a third time as a local council candidate, but as an independent candidate this time rather than allied with a political party.
I see. I wanted to pick up on something. Do you think that there's a sense that people, they want it to go back to how it was pre-something? And my problem with this is they don't seem to realise that was owned as well. That was just a step, along this track. We got here on a very particular journey. We didn't just arrive here for no reason. So do you have trouble kind of interfacing with people who seem to think that this is all something very new, that only recently have they been trying to kill you? Up until before that, we were living in this sort of laissez-faire, if you want to use the word democratic world where you had rights and could make choices and things. Do you have is it difficult trying to kind of talk along these lines with people? Is it that they just want to go back, pre-COVID or pre-9/11 or pre-something, that they're not able to see it in terms of a bigger plan?
Yeah, I think that's true. And all that's happened in COVID is, the velvet fist came off, velvet glove came off the iron fist. The things weren't very different before COVID. They just made it a bit more explicit post-COVID. So yeah, I think it is difficult for people to understand quite how long this has been going on. For instance, people will say, they're against the COVID vaccine, but obviously all other vaccines are fine. And that's putting things, very myopically into this very, very, very kind of short perspective of the last 3 years, and trying to explain to people, which is what I believe, that vaccines have never been fine and have always been a kind of a fraud. Going back to the 1700s, I think trying to get people to see that is too challenging. It's just too challenging for a lot of people because it challenges too many preconceptions. They're able to accept the government lied on this occasion, but not on every occasion.
No, of course. It's like with NASA, if they were lying about the moon landings, well, what else are they lying about? You get to a point where you have to question it all, and people don't want to. It's very simple to train people in this way, because once you've accepted one thing, you end up fighting yourself because you accepted it. It's very hard to admit that you were fooled and that your whole life basically has been meaningless. And people don't want to accept that, and I can understand who would want to accept it. I'm put in mind of the film The Matrix, where Neo, or whoever it is, Morpheus says, we don't try to sort of free someone's mind when they're too old because they can't handle it. They basically break down. I mean, for myself, I just always thought that I've always been somewhat outside of this system and always thought there was something wrong with it, even from a very small child. So the more I discovered about it, even before the internet, in a way I was in preparation for it. Somebody that he's dead now, but I learned quite a lot from, Alan Watts. He used to say that as this gets worse, and he was talking like 2008, 2009, 2010, he said as this agenda rolls out, it gets worse and worse and worse. It's going to be actually easier for people like us to understand it, because we understand basically where it's going. It's basically going to all-out tyranny, total control, and depopulation. It's obvious to anybody with a functioning mind. Yeah. But for the people who still, believe the system and think that it's got something for them, they're going to be breaking down. I mean, once they can't get the cafe latte that they're used to, and once the shop doesn't have the very particular type of biscuits that they like, and then they can't get the whatever meds they're getting from their doctors and whatever. What I wanted to get to is, I mean, I don't know what it's like there, because obviously I'm seeing the I mean, it's called the Russia-Ukraine war, but really it's the Russia-NATO war from this side of the New World Order firewall. What's it like there? Is there a sense of urgency? Because we seem to be, at least if you believe what you see, on the cusp potentially of all-out nuclear holocaust. Is that reality seeping through to people, or are they just ignoring it, or do they think it's far away and nothing to do with them, or something else?
I think people have just gone completely back to normal, in a very superficial way. Everything is normal. All the shops are opened again. You rarely see masks. All the vaccine propaganda is being dismantled. So I think what people believe, and I've seen lots of examples of this, is that COVID was a weird blip. That's over now, and we're all back to normal. That is the predominant belief.
Wow, they're really that stupid, are they?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm afraid so.
Do you ever get to a point where you just think, well, you really all deserve, you're too dumb to exist, you just basically deserve to die? Do you ever get to that point, or are you not there yet?
I try not to, but it's very frustrating, because you see that people just won't fight. And I think that what's happened is everyone born in the West after the Second World War has been given this message that there are no important battles to fight anymore. We've defeated all the evil dictators. We've got rid of all these nasty superstitions. We've now got this perfect utopia, and your only concern is to enjoy yourself. Find a job you like, find some hobbies you like, find people you like, and just have fun. You don't need to think about things deeply. You certainly don't need to fight for anything. And I think that was encapsulated in that book and that philosophy, The End of History. They said, it's inevitable that everything will become a safe, liberal, democratic utopia, and once you've got there, there's nowhere else to go, no battles left to fight, the end. So I think that's what's happened, and people have grown up in that culture, and this is everyone going up to like at least 75. So now when trying to get them to understand, your whole way of life is terribly imperiled. We're in a very serious war. Everything you care about, everyone you care about is at risk. You've got to get up and fight. They just can't comprehend it, because they've never lived through anything like that.
I noticed that with my mother and that generation, the baby boomer generation. They never suffered. They never had to suffer. And the level of expectation and entitlement that everything ought to be just great. And if it was, if you got the wrong kind of coffee, this was some sort of catastrophe or something. I've noticed that. It seems to me, though, that in this end of history scenario, where there is no one left to fight, but there is someone left to fight, Miri, it's you. Because you're the enemy. I'm the enemy. What I've realised now is this is what really Marxism does. It goes out and then finds people to hate, finds wreckers or bourgeois or the intelligentsia. Somebody. It would all work perfectly if it weren't for you. You're the problem. So is there any persecution on in that way, or do you see the first shoots of it kind of poking up through the astroturf?
Well, there's the usual social media attacks. You get a lot of hate and abuse on social media, but beyond that, and in the real world, at the moment, there's not much. The preferred tactics of the establishment and the various institutions seem to be to ignore us. So I have sent so many letters to my local council and MPs and all the rest of it. And actually, my MP did engage quite appropriately and eloquently at the start, but then he suddenly just stopped, as if he'd kind of had the call and told no more of that. So I think that's their tactic at the moment, is to just ignore us. But I think once we move towards more explicit tyranny, which I really do think we will, and very soon, then that's going to change. I know there's this new something called Online Harm Safety Bill or something, where they're discussing repressing expression on the internet for our safety,
Yep.
of course. So I think at the moment they're still in ignoring mode, but that won't last much longer.
As we head toward the end of this conversation, I'd like to know, what do you think their timeline is? I agree with you entirely that we're working through an agenda, and this is just one line in that agenda. And I agree with you that they've got, mass culling, and we've done all the work. The bogs have all been cleared, the roads have all been built. I mean, all you need is a maintenance crew now, and they need maybe a couple of 100 million serfs and security guards and all the rest of it. They're out to kill us all, and there's no question about it. But they're going to make money doing it, and they're going to do it in a sort of a measured, well-managed way. I'm not asking you for sort of a prophecy here, but what's your sense of a timeline? Do you have a sense of a timeline?
Yes, I think that the bulk of the work will be done by 2030. I think that this has been a 10-year plan, and it's not a kind of coincidence that it was kicked off in 2020. They've marked out this decade, so I think but by 2030 they will have achieved most of what they've set out to achieve, and the world will look very, very different.
I have to say I do agree with you. Finally, Miri, how can people find you? Could you give us your web details, just in case people are hearing this on other platforms where they won't be able to check down below?
Yes, absolutely. So my website is miriaf.co.uk, and that's spelled miriaf.co.uk. And on that website, there are links to my other websites, and there's also my email address if people want to get in touch.
That's great, Miri. Thank you very much for joining me today. It's been very interesting. I'm going to upload this after this discussion to various platforms, and I'll send you a link later.
That's great. Thanks very much.
Speak to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So to finalise, I currently upload to Odyssey, Rumble, YouTube and Substack. So please like, share and subscribe on all platforms. It's free to do, but a valuable way of giving back. Go to samgerrans.com and drop your email in the box to subscribe to my Substack newsletter and get all new content delivered to your inbox. I back up my mailing list so that if big tech cancels me, we still have options. I work outside the mainstream and have no corporate sponsorship. If you value what I do, you can help keep the lights on at samgerrans.com/contribute, or upgrade to a paid subscription on my Substack to access my more detailed work as well as comment, Substack being where I read all feedback. I continue to make my legacy projects available free. Summaries and links are at samgerrans.com/books. Finally, I post news, thoughts and announcements to my Telegram channel at t.me/samgerrans. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.